Good evening and welcome to this evening's Lundy webinar. I'm Michael Williams and I'm Secretary of the Lundy Field Society. Welcome also to our new viewers this evening, whether you are watching on Zoom or on YouTube. We have what I think is a record turnout for one of these events, and it's great to have so many of you here. Tonight, I will be joined by Tim Jones, who's going to share his experience, tips and insights to get the most from birdwatching on Lundy. It doesn't matter if you've been to Lundy many times or have yet to visit, as I hope this talk will have something for newcomers and regular visitors alike. I will run through a few housekeeping matters before introducing our speaker. Following Tim's talk, there will be a question and answer session, and I expect we'll finish sometime between 8:30 and 8:45, depending on how many questions we have. I'm coming to you from live from a virtual Morisco tavern, but as usual, this evening I'm at home in Cambridge. Okay, so on to the housekeeping arrangements. If you're a regular viewer, then please do make yourself comfortable while I go through this usual announcement. We won't be able to see or hear any of you at home, as only the microphones and video cameras on Tim's computer and my computer are enabled. As with all these webinars, Dave Richards is behind the scenes hosting the Zoom session. A recording will be available afterwards, and I'll let you know how to find that and all of the previous webinars later. If you're watching on Zoom, then you can ask questions using the Q&A function. Just click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and then type your question into the box that pops up. If you're on a mobile or tablet, then you can find it on the menu bar. There's also a chat feature for comments and feedback, which Dave and I will be monitoring during the talk. If you're watching on YouTube, then I'm afraid there's no facility for you to ask questions. Okay, so without further ado, I will introduce our speaker. And I hope that Tim will shortly appear on our screens. Hello, Tim.
Yep. Hi, Michael, and hi, everybody who's watching.
Great to have you here.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
I'm just going to do a brief introduction to Tim, and then I'll hand over to you. So some of Tim Jones's earliest memories are of primroses, bluebells and rock pools as a toddler growing up on Guernsey, and he has been enthralled by nature and islands ever since. His family moved to Gloucestershire, where thanks to the Young Ornithologist Club, an inspirational biology teacher, local bird watchers and supportive if slightly bemused parents, Tim was soon spending every spare moment with a pair of binoculars around his neck, something that hasn't changed to this day, although you're not wearing any binoculars at the moment, Tim.
They're not far away.
Tim has been visiting Lundy regularly since 1984, and together with his husband Tim Davis published The Birds of Lundy in 2007 alongside a companion website. From their home on the North Devon coast, the Tims are now bird recorders on behalf of the Lundy Field Society, preparing the annual Lundy Bird Report and maintaining the Lundy Birds blog of latest sightings. So thanks very much for coming to talk to us this evening, Tim. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Michael, and hello again, everybody. I understand there's quite a lot of you out there. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through some of the whys, whens, wheres and hows of birdwatching on Lundy. And as Michael said, I'm keenly aware that some of you watching and listening may never have set foot on Lundy, whilst others like myself are regular visitors. I'm also trying to keep in mind that we probably range from expert birders to those who love looking at wildlife, but only occasionally pick up a pair of binoculars, and who wouldn't necessarily call themselves bird watchers. I hope that there's something for everyone in what I have to show you. And as Michael explained, there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So do use the chat box and ask anything that comes to mind as we go along. I'm now going to share my screen so that we can start the presentation. Just bear with me one moment. Nearly there. Okay, I hope everybody's got a full screen of my title slide. Here I am out and about on the island. So why go bird watching on Lundy? Well, there are many reasons, and I suspect that everyone who goes has his or her own personal reason why they love bird watching on Lundy so much. It might be for the seabirds. Here we have a colony of common guillemots. It's probably for its large colonies of breeding seabirds that Lundy is best known. None more so than for the puffins, the iconic puffins, and probably many of you will know that the name Lundy itself is a corruption of the Old Norse term for Puffin Island. We'll come back to the puffins later on. For me, and I know for many others, the big draw to Lundy is migration. Lundy is only a small island. Here we see its place in the world, but the birds that pass through Lundy or breed on Lundy at other times of year distribute themselves across an incredible section of the globe, which I've tried to demarcate here in red. It's a little bit approximate, but it gives you the general idea. And the yellow dots are places where birds that occur on Lundy may be in particular at other times of year. I just wanted to look right now at 4 of the species that pass through Lundy, which undertake some of these incredible journeys. Starting with Manx shearwater, a species of seabird, which nests in burrows on Lundy, some 5,500 pairs at the last count. And here is their global distribution. Lundy is, of course, the red star. The areas you see in orange are the breeding colonies, and then in blue is where Manx shearwaters go to in our winter time and during their migrations. And the blue star right down in the South Atlantic is where some Lundy shearwaters, or many Lundy shearwaters in fact, go to spend our winter in the southern summer off Tierra del Fuego. Absolutely extraordinary journey. At a different scale, this is a land bird, the northern Wheatier, which is a small bird roughly the size of the sparrow. There are about 100 pairs nest on Lundy, but many hundreds more pass through the island on both spring and autumn migrations. Here is their global distribution, again, breeding areas in orange. And you can see that all of them, no matter where in the world they're breeding, go to spend the winter in Africa. And all of these birds that pass between Africa and Europe may also stop off on Lundy, including many which go all the way to Greenland and Arctic Canada to nest. And you imagine once they've left Lundy and Ireland, they've got that big ocean crossing. So they're spending the winter in the Sahara and the summer in the Arctic. My own favorite migrant bird is the swallow. Just a handful of pairs nest on Lundy, 1 pair usually in the church porch and a handful in the other buildings, but many thousands pass through on migration. And if you're lucky on a good day in spring or autumn, you may see 5,000 or 10,000 swallows passing through Lundy. Here's their global distribution, and inset, this is showing really where British and Irish swallows journey. So they're migrating primarily to southernmost Africa. Again, an extraordinary journey. And Lundy is just a wonderful place to be able to have insights into some of these journeys and to experience migration for yourself. Another different kind of bird, this is a wader, although it's associated more with woodlands than with water, the woodcock. They breed right across northern Eurasia, particularly Russia, moving south and west in the winter. And I'm afraid the quality of this shot isn't brilliant, but each coloured line and each square is an individual woodcock and these are the migratory journeys of individual birds traced by satellite from Eastern Europe and Russia to Britain and Ireland. And if I just use my pointer, you can see this square here, right over on the right-hand side in Eastern Russia, Siberia. If your geography is good, you'll know that this country here is Mongolia. So just extraordinary how far some birds are coming to visit Lundy. Woodcocks pass through Lundy on autumn migration, and a few spend the winter there. Let's move in a little bit closer now. There's Lundy circled in red. As you can see, this wonderful satellite shot was taken in late March a few years ago. And in late March, spring migration is in full swing, but continental Europe can still be quite cold at this season. So many early migrants tend to follow the western seaboard of Europe and will be coming up to Lundy from the south and southwest, perhaps from Spain, or even from France, directly from Spain and Portugal, and from there, from the southwest peninsula, Lundy and the Bristol Channel, spreading out to other parts of England, Scotland, and then taking this land bridge across from Pembrokeshire to southeast Ireland and spreading out across Ireland. And as we've seen with northern Wheatiers, some will even go right up and carry on towards Greenland. At the same time, in early spring, huge numbers of seabirds are returning from their winter quarters in the Atlantic to breed on Lundy. It's not only the breeding birds. Lundy is also a fantastic place to see rare and unusual birds, whether it's something exotic but fairly regular, like this hoopoe that was photographed on Lundy last April, or this Siberian breeding white's thrush, which spent 3 weeks on Lundy last October, only the second record for the island, and there are just a handful of these every year in Britain. Or in this case, a completely unique record. This is a bird called the ancient Murlet, which is a very small kind of auk, so related to puffins and guillemots. This is what it looks like in its breeding plumage. It usually hangs out in the North Pacific Rim, both in the breeding season and in the winter. But back in the 1990s, one found its way to Lundy and spent 3 breeding seasons forlornly camped out on the west coast of Lundy with the other auks, looking for a mate. It didn't attract a mate, but it did attract vast numbers of twitchers. Bird watchers that are particularly keen to see very rare birds are known as twitchers because they're said to twitch. They get very anxious that they're going to miss it. And this was a twitch for the ancient Murlet on the west coast of Lundy in June 1991. And you can see a few leftover 1980s haircuts there as well. But not rare birds. I think one of the great things for many people about Lundy is that it holds quite good breeding populations of small land birds, which are becoming quite rare on the mainland due to environmental losses. Amongst them, linnets, this very smart male in its breeding plumage, and something I always enjoy when I go to Lundy. I mean, Tim and I in 20 years have seen a starling twice in our garden here, but there's a healthy breeding population on Lundy. And look at this male on the right hand side there, resplendent in his breeding plumage, iridescent, something I always enjoy seeing. And whether you're there for seabirds, migrants, rarities, or just the common birds that you might see around you, Lundy offers exquisite backdrops, wonderful landscapes and seascapes. That is when the sun shines like it is here in spring. Talking of which, when are the best times to visit Lundy for bird watching, and perhaps the best times of day to go bird watching? I've put this together as a sort of calendar of the main times of year, the main ornithological events during the year. So spring migration will be starting any day now. In fact, some of the sort of early movements, some of the seabirds and some land birds already underway. but we'll reach a peak in April and May and extend into June with the last arrivals, species like swifts and spotted flycatchers. At the other end of the season, autumn migration, well, there's hardly any gap between the end of spring migration and the start of autumn migration. Already in mid-July, warblers like willow warblers are starting to move south, and with a succession of different species right through until early December, with very much a peak in September and October. You can see that the breeding seabird season is also quite long, but if you're particularly interested in the guillemots, razorbills, and I know above all for a lot of people it's the puffins they want to see, really the period sort of late April to early July is to be recommended, with late May and June favourite. By the time it gets to the school holidays in July, most puffins have left the island and a lot of families are disappointed. With regard to time of day, this is I think most people realise that if you're watching wildlife, early morning is often very, very good. And this is almost as early as it gets. This is in May, this is sunrise looking off the east side of Lundy. If your local geography is good, you'll know that this is Foreland Point on the North Devon mainland. And at this time of year, the sun is far to the north and is rising soon after 5 o'clock. It's a great time to be out, but often on Lundy early in the morning, it can be quite cold. And you can go out at dawn and think, oh, well, there's nothing much around. Give it a couple of hours for the sun to get going, warm things up, get the insects moving, and suddenly birds are popping out of everywhere. So one lesson learned might be stay a little bit longer in bed in the morning. You don't necessarily lose anything. When we get to autumn, this is October, and here again we can see Foreland Point, and look how far to the south the sunrise has moved. And of course now the day length is much shorter, but every species of wildlife, including birds, has to cram in what it needs to do in the days in the hours of daylight. And very, very often in the first couple of hours after dawn on an October morning, and the same in September and November, you can get a really excellent visible overhead movement of migrants. So this is a really good time to be out bird watching. Lundy gets its fair share of storms. This is the northern tip of the island with a good westerly or northwesterly storm swell blowing. In these kinds of conditions, because of the way Lundy lies north-south, the east side can provide lots of shelter for storm-driven seabirds, and you sometimes get big flocks of gulls and other species building up there. And exceptionally, very severe storms like this one at the end of October 2013, the so-called St. Jude's Day storm, you might remember. This was so fast moving and so intense that it blew North American species, yellow-rumped warbler, all the way across the Atlantic, and Tim and I were lucky enough to bump into it in one of the valleys on Milcombe. And it didn't look any the worse for wear. It's incredible to think the distance that it had come. Always on islands in particular, a change in the weather is a great time to go out birding. If it's migration season, species will be looking to continue their journeys as soon as the weather improves, and just amongst the regular breeding birds or birds that started the day on land, they'll be trying to get out to feed, having been hunkered down during heavy rain or strong winds. So anytime you see a marked improvement in the weather, no matter what time of day it is, get out with your binoculars and start looking. Like many other islands, Lundy also has its fair share of sea fogs, particularly in spring, where you can get very warm air overlying very cold, still sea. And although, of course, sea fog is a great hazard to mariners and shipping, it can also be a hazard to migrating birds. the sea fog can disorientate them as much as it does us. And suddenly, if you get a sort of parting in the fog, birds suddenly see land below and make a beeline for it. So I've seen that being the case with very small birds, finches and buntings, as well as much larger ones like cormorants. So in this kind of patchy sea fog kind of condition, it can be very good birding. Some of the best birding, or most exciting birding, can be at night. Here we're back at the North Lighthouse. We see Chris D and Tim Davis putting up a mist net to catch storm petrels. This is a very small seabird, about the size, well, not that much bigger than a house sparrow, in fact. You don't get much sense of size from this photo. This was one that had just been ringed and was being released. They come ashore only at night to feed their young in crevices between the rocks. And similarly, their larger cousin, the Manx shearwater that I mentioned earlier, here we see a young one getting ready to fledge outside its burrow, probably in August or September. And they're very, very vocal throughout the breeding season. You don't have to go too far away from the village to be able to hear their incredibly distinctive calls. Also at night, bird ringers go out to use the technique called dazzling, which involves using a strong light to locate wading birds, like this tiny diminutive jack snipe, the much smaller relative of the common snipe. And the Lundy birding experience isn't confined to the island itself. From the moment the ship leaves either Ilfracombe or Bideford for the 2-hour crossing to the island, if conditions allow and your stomach allows, I always recommend having a pair of binoculars handy. You stand a good chance of seeing seabirds, maybe some migrating land birds. I've seen wheatear, willow warbler, meadow pipit and swallow from the decks of the ship, and sometimes porpoises and dolphins. And once you're on the island, never be far from your binoculars. You never know what is going to fly over. You might not be specifically bird watching. Something flies over, there just isn't time to delve in a rucksack, and certainly not to go back to wherever you're staying. Tim and I discovered this very much last October, when we were fortunate to have Lundy's first white-tailed eagle in 140 years almost fly over our heads in a most unexpected place, not that you could probably ever expect it. And had we not had our binoculars around our necks at the time, we'd have missed out on a fantastic experience. So those are some things about the whys and the whens. Probably, I guess what many of you would be interested in, especially those who have never been to the island before, is where should you be trying to look for birds on the island. As I put here, some parts of the island are perhaps better than others. Just to introduce you to the island, if you don't know it, it's essentially a big plateau surrounded by very high cliffs, and on the eastern side, hidden from us here, slightly gentler sidelands, but still pretty high and steep. This more sort of stylized map includes a few sort of orientating points. Here, the B shows where the boat comes in. The V is the village. The two L's here in the south and in the north are the two lighthouses, which are currently functioning. The L in brackets here is the original lighthouse, now called the Old Light, which was built in the 19th century on the highest point of the island. Unfortunately, also the first point of the island to get covered in low clouds, so it wasn't great as a location for a lighthouse. And then here at Tibbets, this is the second highest point of the island. So where would you go in across this whole island, which, as I've put on the left-hand side, there is some 445 hectares. So it may seem small, but in actual fact, it really isn't. It's quite big, especially if you consider the very indented coastline, which can take an entire day to walk all around the ins and outs. Season, of course, is important. Weather is critical, especially the wind direction and strength. The east side here is relatively sheltered from strong westerly winds. I'm sure that last week during the mini beast from the east, it was anything but sheltered and must have been extremely cold. But because of this sort of north-south orientation, there is always, or nearly always, somewhere sheltered to go and look for birds. And that's a real consideration to have in mind, as is the time of day, especially if it's sunny weather. Before you go out in the morning, think about where you're heading to in relation to where the sun is going to be shining. To see birds at their best and to have the best chance of identifying them, you really need to have the sun behind you, and certainly avoid walking somewhere where you're going to have the sun straight into your eyes. And some of you might be visiting Lundy for the first time on a day trip, in which case you'd only have between 4 and 6 hours ashore, depending on whether you're going from Ilfracombe and Bideford. And it simply isn't realistic to try and cover the whole island in one day. So I'm going to now look at some of the best locations. Oh, but just before I do that, just a bit more orientation. This is the village, a photograph taken from the top of the church tower. Just to point out a few features, this is the camping field where you can stay, the tavern garden where that breakfast with binoculars was, the roof of the tavern, shop is here, farm is here, and many of the other buildings you can actually rent from the Landmark Trust, which runs the island on a long lease on behalf of the owners, the National Trust. Also, just to show the position of the village in relation to where you land, here is the landing bay and the jetty down here, the church and the village up here, and there are 2 valleys which you come up from the beach to get up to the village. I'm now going to look at some of the best bird watching spots on the island, and in each case there's a little inset map to the side of the screen with a red dot showing you where that location is if you don't already know Lundy well. So this is Castle Hill, the southeasternmost point of Lundy. It's a fantastic place to stand and watch for migrants in spring or autumn as they either move south in the autumn or north in the spring. And the shelter afforded by the castle ramparts here, depending on the wind direction, can make it a good sea watching location. But it's really standing on Castle Hill in autumn, looking for visible migration in the first couple of hours of dawn that really excites me about this place. I sometimes think that the people who live on Lundy must sometimes think that they've had some sort of military invasion overnight when they open their curtains in the morning and see a line of men dressed in green standing on the hill. If you're lucky, you can see hundreds, if not thousands of birds passing overhead in a couple of hours, but everything does depend on the weather. Not too windy and a little bit of cloud cover is good because it makes the birds fly a bit lower and you can hear and see them better. The eastern side of the island, as I said before, is the one that's sort of sheltered from the westerly winds, the prevailing winds, and it has much more vegetation. There are no trees and shrubs on the western side of Lundy apart from some stunted gorse, whereas there's more luxuriant vegetation in the east. Here we see Milcombe, the main wooded valley of the island. The villa in the foreground is Milcombe House, which was built in the 19th century for the then owner of the island. And this little area of vegetation that you see has probably held more rare birds over the years than most areas its size anywhere in Britain. But it's not only rare birds, it's a place where common breeding birds occur in their greatest numbers, amongst them a few pairs of robins. You see this one has a ring on its leg. Milcombe is also the centre of bird ringing operations on the island. It's also a magnet for passing migrant birds. Here we see a beautiful wood warbler, which might have spent the winter in African rainforests, on its way north, gleaning aphids on sycamores in Milcombe. A little further north along the east side, we come to one of the other treed areas on the island. This is a much smaller area of trees, but it's still a magnet for passing migrants. And we see it here in early spring with its carpet of primroses and bluebells. Spotted flycatchers favour this area on migration, and a couple of years ago, no, it's more than that now, 2017, I think, a pair actually bred in that copse, which is called quarter wall copse. A little further north, still along the east side, the trees sort of fade away, and you're left with some clumps of willows. Here's a clump of willows, and there's bramble. This part of the island was used for, or exploited for quarrying in the 19th century, commercially unsuccessful granite quarries. But one of the legacies of that quarrying has been this wide, this wide path, open area known as the Terrace, which provides a great walking area, and there's bramble and willow scrub, provides excellent bird watching. And here you can see a wooden structure, which is the slightly derelict remains of a Heligoland trap, which is a kind of wooden and wire structure which is used to catch migrating birds, originated on the Baltic island of Helgoland in the last century. And if you know anything about Heligoland traps, you'll know that this one is in extremely poor repair, but I'm glad to say that there are some plans afoot to renovate it later this year. Amazingly, if I just go back to that last photograph, just this area here next to the trap is the location of where this extraordinarily rare bird was seen in September last year. It's an American species called a Sora, or a Sora rail, sort of distantly related to water rails and moorhens. And the warden found this bird in quite a tired state, clambering about in the vegetation, and he was able to just bend down and pick it up. But it was seen again, and it did seem to be in fairly good condition in spite of his extraordinarily long journey. Moving up onto the island plateau, you see extensive grassy areas, very, very little cover. This is the domain of breeding birds such as meadowpipits and skylarks, both of which nest in large numbers. The southern part of the plateau is farmed, but as we move further north up the island, the plateau becomes sort of wilder in appearance. This is in autumn when the clumps of Molinia are shining in the sunset, and you see also heather moorland here. So very, very little vegetation cover, and it's Lundy's extensive network of large dry stone granite walls, which act much the way that hedgerows do on the mainland, providing all sorts of resources for birds, whether it be nest sites for birds like pied wagtail, especially around the village, nesting in crevices in the wall, song perches for things including cuckoos, small numbers of which continue to breed on the island in some years, or at least calling, trying to attract a mate, and they'll be parasitizing meadow pipits. The dry stone walls also provide perches for birds of prey to look for food. And then in the migration season, they provide food and shelter for large numbers of migrants, including the diminutive goldcrest, Britain's smallest breeding bird, or something a little bit scarcer, grasshopper warbler, a migrant that can sometimes be found creeping around in the walls a bit like a mouse. So you really never know what you're going to see, but always keep a very close eye on the walls, especially during migration. In autumn and winter, who knows, you might get a snow bunting like this one pop up on top of the wall, perched. That is if the locals, the Lundy ponies, don't get there first. Freshwater is always a great place to go bird watching, and there are several areas of freshwater around Lundy. This is one of the seasonal pools in the south of the island called Kistvein Pond. It can be a good place to look for snipe and waders, but also in the gorse scrub around the pool, a great place for small migrants. Further north in the middle of the island, this is known as Ponsbu. This is the largest area of freshwater on Lundy. It's artificial. It's made from damming a watercourse for livestock drinking, made in the last century. It's got a small resident breeding population of mallards. In the last few years, teal have bred successfully in this area, also water rail. But it's probably, again, during the migration season that Ponsbu really comes into its own, attracting a variety of birds, large and small. And these sort of freshwater areas, most likely place to see migrant waders like these dunlin. Moving to the west side, this is the exposed Atlantic-facing coast of the island. This is the area known as Jenny's Cove, which is battered by huge Atlantic storms and salt spray and fierce winds. So as you can see, there's no vegetation apart from grass, heather, and thrift, and these spectacular cliff faces which support Lundy's major colonies of breeding auks. These are the latest breeding numbers from the census carried out in 2017. I wanted to draw your attention to, well, a couple of things. First, the puffin numbers. 375, it doesn't sound a lot, certainly compared to some other islands like Skoma, where there are thousands. But by 2000, Lundy's puffins were down to 5 or less. Since the eradication of rats was declared successful in 2006, puffins have made a big comeback. There are now over 400, and it seems every likelihood they'll continue to increase. Both the other species shown here are also increasing. The white arrow shows that red object, which is a colour ring fixed to the leg of this guillemot. It was put on in the nest when this guillemot was a chick in Skoma Island. And this guillemot then emigrated to Lundy and successfully reared a chick at Jenny's Cove last year. Jenny's Cove is also the domain of soaring birds, whether they be seabirds like fulmars or the majestic peregrine falcon. And all of these breeding birds can be viewed to the constant sound backdrop of a cleep of breeding oyster catchers, about 18 pairs of them scattered around the coast of Lundy, including here at Jenny's Cove. Finally, right up to the north end of the island, the far tip of the island, this is the North Light that was constructed at the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries, and is said to be disturbance from the construction of the lighthouse that led to the disappearance of Lundy's last breeding gannets, always a small population. However, the North Light continues to be a great place to see feeding and passing gannets. In the right conditions, you can see feeding frenzies of a couple of hundred, maybe, of very spectacular seabird. And other seabirds, such as these shags, feed in the tide race off North Light, and it's probably one of the best places to go sea watching on Lundy in the autumn, for example, seeing passing skuas. So, how to get the most from birding on Lundy? A few sort of tips and ideas to finish with. First of all, you absolutely don't need any really fancy, huge, spectacular equipment. A pair of binoculars is enough. For bird watching, think about their magnification and light gathering ability. I would say that 8 by 42 or 10 by 42 are ideal. The 8 and the 10 tell you how many times the magnification is, and the 42 is the diameter of these lenses in millimeters, and the bigger that number is, the more light they let in. But also think about the weight and the feel. You don't want a pair of binoculars that are so heavy every morning you're getting ready to go out and you think, no, I'll leave them behind, they're too heavy. And really pay attention to the feel. Different makes of binoculars suit different individuals' hands very differently. For Lundy, of course, weather resistance is all important. Are they at least resistant, if not waterproof? Are they going to be resistant to rain, salt spray? There's very, very strong winds and strong sun. And do they focus closely? Modern binoculars, some of them focus fantastically closely, and they can open up a whole new world for you. And only after thinking about these things, maybe think about price and brand. I think, like with many things these days, it's very easy to get fixated on brand and think, oh, I've got to have that particular sort. But think about the practicalities first. And a good pair of close focusing binoculars will help you enjoy much of Lundy's other wildlife, like green tiger beetles, a mating pair here. And when you look the wrong way through binoculars, I don't know whether you've all tried that, they kind of act like a big magnifying glass, and you can get to appreciate flora and insects close up, like the sheepspit scabious on the right and the famous Lundy cabbage on the left. And if you want more advice on binoculars and nature equipment in general, you can do no better than to contact this chap, Richard Campy, who's a long-time Lundy birdwatcher, used to live on the island, in fact, and manage the bar in the Morisco Tavern. He's now the director of the Onestop Nature Shop, and you can contact him on those details on the screen now. I get an enormous pleasure from keeping notes on the birds that I see, whether it's in the yellow waterproof Write in the Rain notebooks that I use on Lundy with a pencil, basics, paper and pencil, or the diaries that I've been keeping since my teens. They go the Pomposity of Youth, Ornithological Notes and Records, 1983, how about that? But I keep a diary of all my days on Lundy right up to the present day. There's the last day that I spent on Lundy, and you can see it's not just about birds, it's about banal things as well, like what I had for breakfast, but brings back every moment with great pleasure reading them years later. Do share what you have seen with Lundy's warden, Dean Jones, fantastic birder himself, and he's taken a number of the photographs I've shown you tonight. He'll always be happy to chat about what you've seen, hear about what you've seen, and to help you identify anything you can't recognize. In the tavern is a logbook, at least in non-COVID times in the tavern, there is a logbook where you can sit and write up what you've seen. Is maintained by the Lundy Field Society, of which more later. And what could be better than at the end of the day to sit down with your favourite tipple and fill in information into the logbook about the birds you've seen. This is Keith Hiscock, renowned ornithologist. In actual fact, he's a marine biologist and the father of marine conservation on Lundy, but he has been known to look at birds occasionally too. The Lundy Field Society I just mentioned is the society, the organisation to join if you've got any interest in Lundy's nature or history and archaeology, all types of nature it caters to. The LFS, increasingly we're using the hashtag Discover Lundy, because LFS is all about discovering more about Lundy. You can find out more about the LFS at this website, and you can join online. Amongst other things, there's an annual report, including the annual bird report shown here. The LFS also runs ringing on the island. To date, 125,000 birds have been ringed on Lundy. And if you want to take things a little further, why not contribute to one of the many citizen science outlets that allow you to make the most of your birding on Lundy? Birdtrack is perhaps the best known. maintained by the BTO. You can get an app for your phone, keep records of what you've seen. You don't need to be connected to the internet all the time, which for those of you who know Lundy is just as well. But you can add your records using the app and then upload them to the database when you get back to the mainland. You can use your mobile phone to record bird sounds as well as take photographs. I think a lot of people forget to use their mobiles to make recordings. This was a continental coal tit, a rare relative of our normal British coal tit. It's sort of grayer and much more boldly plumaged. And it spent a few days in Milcombe one May a few years ago. And I used my mobile phone to both record sound and video of this bird. I'm not sure whether you're going to be able to hear this or not, but it's extraordinary how just with a mobile phone held in your hand, you can get very high quality recordings. And it picked up lots of background calls as well as the coal tit that was the aim of my recording. In 2007, Tim Davis and I published this book, The Birds of Lundy, 14 years ago already, which is kind of scary and shocking. But we do have this website, birdsoflundy.org.uk, where we have published updates continuously since then. So we brought all of the species accounts in the book up to date. So even if you can't get hold of a copy of the book, you can go to the website and find all of the latest information. Also bringing Lundy to your fingertips is the blog, whose address is shown here. This is updated very regularly. Tim and I update it using information contributed by lots of different bird watchers, but in particular by Dean Jones, the warden who you saw earlier, who has been doing it almost single-handedly, of course, during the time the island has been closed in lockdown. So very big thanks to Dean. And just to bring you absolutely bang up to date, this is a photograph taken on Lundy by Dean this morning, a misty morning in February. And he took this photograph of 3 Lapland buntings, rare visitors to Lundy, very unusual to see 3 together, especially at this time of year. He took these in the High Street field this morning. So thanks, Dean, for bringing us so much up to date. And my very last slide is to talk about the Bird Observatories network. This is a network of migration hotspots all around Britain and Ireland, from the Channel Islands to Cape Clear in Southwest Ireland, right up to Orkney and Shetland. Until 1968, Lundy was part of this network, but sadly, mainly for economic reasons, it was obliged to withdraw in the late 60s and has not been part of the network since. I'm very, very excited to say that discussions are underway, albeit at an early stage, with a view to Lundy potentially rejoining the network and playing its full part again. You can find out more about bird observatories through the website that's on the screen here. So with that, here is a shot of Tim and myself enjoying everything that Lundy has to offer. And we're raising a glass to Lundy's potentially exciting future as a bird observatory once again, but looking ahead to another fantastic year of Lundy birding, and wishing all of you happy visits to Lundy, especially if you've never been there before. So thanks very much. And that's all, everyone. And I'll stop my screen sharing now and hand back to Michael.
Tim, that's absolutely fantastic. A really fantastic insight into so much about bird watching and the wildlife that we so regularly see, and indeed we don't regularly see on Lundy. So thank you so much for that. Please do stick around. We've got lots of questions come in already, so I'm going to just get cracking straight into the questions. And in fact, I'm going to go to Richard Campy for the first question. So Tim mentioned Richard, who supplies a lot of equipment for the birders. So let me just pull up. I've now lost Richard's question. Here we go. So Richard says, Lundy has been a host to some incredibly rare birds over the decades. But what in all your many years of birding on Lundy has been your most incongruous sighting?
Oh, there's a question and a half, Richard. I think it probably has to be that that white-tailed eagle that I showed earlier. I mean, nothing could have been so unexpected, given the circumstances, to just look up and see this thing like the size of a flying barn door going past. It was just so a combination of incredible excitement and just so unexpected, and such a spectacular bird. So it probably has to be that, I would think.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to move straight on to the next question, which is from Anna Phoenix. So Anna is going to Lundy to stay in the Old Light at the end of May. She'd like to know, do you have any tips for people completely new to Lundy and birds? And she's also looking for suggestions about how she can engage her 11-year-old.
Okay, well, perhaps one of the best things to do would be to attend the talk that would be given by the warden or another member of the island conservation team, Lundy Above and Below the Waves. It's a sort of introductory talk to the island and all of its nature, not just the birds. So look out for that. There are guided walks on many of the days when the boat sails during the spring and summer season. So that's a possibility. And always, look out for people who have got binoculars. Nearly all of the bird watchers who go regularly to Lundy will be only too delighted to help newcomers find their way around. In the Birds of Lundy book, you'll be able to find a copy of that in the tavern. There are some suggested walking routes which are particularly good for bird watching. And visit the blog that I showed you before. That will tell you just ahead of your visit what has been around and what you might expect to see.
Thank you, Tim. In fact, you mentioned some good walking routes. I'm just going to jump over to a question from Clive Smith. He says, would you go and spend a few hours in one spot or close to one spot, or generally wander around for the day to get the best experience?
Yeah, I think that's one of the lessons to learn about bird watching that comes with experience, that it's rarely possible to sort of set foot outside the door in the morning and say, right, I'm going to go there and see this. You need to be really open to both those options. So just wandering slowly where the will sort of takes you, but also to just sit still in one spot and look at what comes. I mean, especially if you're interested in the breeding seabirds, I would recommend very, very much going to one of sort of two spots just near the earthquake, if you know Lundy, and near Halfway Wall, just sitting and looking with a pair of binoculars. You don't need to go clambering around the sidelands, which apart from potentially being dangerous, can perhaps attract less experience. If you know Lundy very well, it could attract less experienced, not very well shod visitors to go to dangerous places, but above all, it might unintentionally cause disturbance. So very much for the seabirds sitting and looking. And also at migration times, as I said, sort of standing in one place, like on Castle Hill or at the top of Milcombe Valley, just for a couple of hours, just watching what comes by, can be completely absorbing. But other times, it's just great to wander slowly, and see what comes to you. And that was very much the case that the day that eagle flew over, we were just wandering with no particular plan in mind.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Clive. I'm going to move to a question from Paul Connolly. Hello, Paul. Good to hear from you. Is there anything distinct or unique about Lundy that attracts migrating birds more than other parts of the UK? Or does the island just get its fair share of migrants as they head north?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, islands, headlands, anywhere with that little bit of sort of remoteness to it is more likely to attract passing migrants. If they want to make landfall, they sort of look down and they get drawn to these headlands and islands. But in some cases, I think it's very much Lundy's location. If you think of where it is on that map, that satellite photograph I showed of migration in spring with everything moving south, many birds go to Ireland to breed, but don't necessarily want to make a long sea crossing. So they'll be sort of land hopping, if you like, from the southwest peninsula over Lundy to Pembrokeshire, and then the quite short sea crossing to southeast Ireland in the sort of vicinity of Rosslare. And I think it's also something to do with Lundy's north-south orientation makes it very, very good for just observing, sort of tuning into those movements that are going roughly north-south in those two big migration seasons.
Okay, thank you, Tim. A very short question next from Phil Buckley, which is, when do the starlings turn up on Lundy?
Hi, Phil. Well, that's interesting. As far as we know, the starlings which breed on the island, there are about 55 pairs that breed in the buildings around the village, in the old light, and even some in the dry stone granite walls. They seem to be there all year. Then you've got large numbers that arrive during autumn migration, sometimes 1,000, 2,000 or more passing through in a day. But there are starlings to be seen on Lundy every day of the year. But there hasn't been any sort of really dedicated study of starlings. Actually, one thing that reminds me of whilst we're talking on dedicated studies is just to mention that there's a very, very long running study of Lundy's resident house sparrow population. And there are also long running studies on Manx shearwaters and wheatiers. And any or all of those species would make good topics for seminars webinars by others in their own right. So have that in mind for when you're looking for more webinars, Michael.
Yeah, I've got Jamie lined up, or not lined up, but Jamie is aware that he might be asked to give a talk about the Lundy Sparrow project in the near future. I don't know whether Jamie's watching, but I will be in touch with him. We've got a few comments coming from our viewers. Chris Pawson says, great presentation, Tim, thank you. Liza Cole says, fab, thanks, Tim. Steve Wing, who's on Cape Clear, says, really wonderful to be watching Lundy and listening to Tim's expert advice. Good to hear from you, Steve. Sean Robson says, many thanks, Tim, great talk. Hopefully see you on Lundy this year. Cheers, Sean and Marie.
I've got a bone to pick with Sean. He saw a magpie on Lundy. Now, some of you might not know, but magpies and Lundy do not go together. Magpie is an exceptionally rare bird on Lundy, almost as rare as white-tailed eagle. And Sean was on Lundy in September on the same day as me and Tim last year. We stayed a week together, and Sean, on the day he arrived, saw a magpie. didn't realize how exceptionally rare it was. Didn't think to mention it until later when we were doing the log, and everybody's jaw hit the floor. But anyway, by that time it was too late. But it's really great that that Sean saw magpie on Lundy.
Steve Wing, I think, has also seen a magpie on Lundy as well. So just rubbing it in there.
And I'd like to say hello to Cape Clear and Steve. Steve was himself living on Lundy for many years now at Cape Clear Bird Observatory, part of the observatory's network. So it's a family of islands.
And just one final note before I go back to the questions. Lynn Pateman's been in touch, says thanks very much, and she's watching from, it's just disappeared, from the Wensum Valley Birdwatching Society in Norfolk. So they're in close to my part of the world rather than your part of the world, but great to have you along. Right, so back to the questions. We've got so many questions, so we'll just keep ploughing on, and I'll try and get through as many as possible. So we'll try and be concise. Joanne Wilby, hello Joe, says, would I be right in thinking that most, if not all, vagrants, such as the yellow-rumped warbler, are unlikely to ever get back to their usual habitat?
I think it varies. I think for a transatlantic vagrant like the yellow-rumped warbler, that's true, because it would have to recross the Atlantic against prevailing weather. I think in the case of a lot of other rare birds, they do stand a good chance of reorientating themselves and actually getting back to the right habitat. And like that hoopoe that you saw earlier, that probably just sort of overshot. It just sort of gone a bit further north than it meant to. It might have been heading for France or Spain, and there's every chance that it would have got back. But I think perhaps in general, the further off course it is, the less likely it is to get back. But it doesn't necessarily apply.
Thank you. A question from Tony John. Hello, Tony. Knowing Lundy as you do, can you predict which species might be the next new bird for the islands? Good question.
This is a game that we play quite a lot amongst regular Lundy bird watchers. I should say hello, Tony, who knows Lundy like the back of his hand himself, and does the butterfly and moth report for the LFS annual report. One that it's quite amazing that it's not on the Lundy list yet is velvet scoter, which is a kind of sea duck, not that extraordinarily rare in British terms. It's certainly seen from time to time off the South Devon coast, but never from Lundy. So yeah, that would be perhaps a good shout. I can tell you what the last one was to be added. That was in December, during the year just gone, which was great white egret, when Martin Thorne saw 3 of them flying offshore from the castle.
Great, thank you. We've had quite a number of people asking you what your favourite sighting is, but we've covered that one off. I'm going to move to a question from Paul Britton. You've mentioned overwintering woodcock, but what other birds or other fauna might be found around during the winter, say the end of January? Yeah,
it's actually one of my favourite times to go to the island in winter. There are not huge numbers of birds, at least not huge numbers of different species, but you get lots of peace and quiet, and you really get to enjoy the things that are there. So offshore, you might have some large flocks of kittiwakes off the east side, maybe great northern and red-throated divers. Around the seabird colonies, fulmars and guillemots in sort of calmer weather are already coming back to the colonies by that time, even from November for both species. There are sort of small numbers of things like firecrests, snow bunting, chiffchaff, not always, not every year, but Occasionally those things sort of overwinter. Black redstarts. Rock pipits, a small brown bird that breed around the coasts. They tend to sort of gather on the top of the island during the winter, and you can see them at very close range much more easily than you can oftentimes in the summer. So it's a different season, a gentler season in terms of the sort of numbers and variety, but it definitely does offer does offer something.
So Paul's question started off by talking about woodcocks, and we've got a question from Brian and Lita Woodcock. They say, from 2 woodcocks overwintering in Gloucestershire, your binoculars must get a fair amount of wear and tear. Where would you go to get them cleaned and serviced? And thanks so much for a superb talk.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, it depends. It depends partly on how fancy your binoculars are. I mean, I've got an expensive pair of binoculars, which you know, because I use them all the time, it was sort of worth that investment. And for those more expensive ones, I would send them away to the manufacturer to get serviced. For sort of cheaper pairs, I mean, the part of the knack is to sort of try to keep them in good nick yourself. I can hear the other Tim laughing his head off here because he'll think I treat my binoculars appallingly. But just try to keep them clean and dry. Just use a very soft lens cloth and an airbrush to keep grit off them. I mean, the worst thing you can do is to sort of rub them vigorously to get mud splashes and things off, because you'll just get a sort of nice frosted glass effect. So I think service with the manufacturers for the more expensive pairs, and then liaise with optic companies like the One Stop Nature Shop. Other suppliers are available, and they will advise you. But in general, a well-treated pair of more expensive binoculars should last a lifetime.
Thank you. A question from Lizzie Williams. A question about the puffins. Lizzie visited Lundy for the first time last July. Was a bit disappointed that the only puffins that she could see were rafting off Jenny's Cove. Would you recommend a boat trip for closer sightings?
I wouldn't necessarily recommend a boat trip, but what I would recommend is going on one of the guided walks. The guided walks on the days that the boat sails from Ilfracombe or Bideford, there are usually, during the puffin season, there are usually guided walks that take you to the best places to see puffins from. And then you will know sort of where to go back to sort of on your own for the best views. Because the colony is still small, I explained earlier that it's recovering from years of predation by rats. It's growing, but it's still a relatively small number of birds, and they are relatively far down the sidelands. But with a bit of time and patience, you can see them quite well. But it is knowing precisely where to go, both for the best views, your own safety, and not to accidentally disturb puffins. I think it's one of the things, as the colony increases, we want them to feel safe to expand higher up the sidelands, and that's perhaps less likely to happen if people are getting too close. But yeah, join one of the guided walks. That's what I would say.
Great advice, thank you. Question from Ali Shepherd. Can you recommend a handy bird guide that is not too large to take out when walking around the island?
Yeah, well, I would suggest for practicality, get an app for your phone. I mean, it'll cut down on weight and space, and perhaps the best one that you can get is the Collins Bird Guide. That would help you identify pretty much any bird you're likely to see. And there's also an optional extra that will have video clips and sound recordings as well. So that's very good. There are more basic ones too. And Tim and I have been talking with Richard Campy for some time about making a little guide, a little hand guide to Lundy birds that could sort of reasonably identify any bird you are likely to see on a day trip. We haven't got around to it yet, but it's in production, shall we say. But in the meantime, I really would advise getting one of the apps for your phone. It's the most practical thing.
Thank you. We look forward to the Tim and Richard guide to Lundy birds. You can buy it from the Lundy Field Society, I'm sure, when it's published.
I'm sure you'll be able to do that.
Next question's from Paul Dietrich. If you were visiting Lundy in the autumn and had wet, cloudy weather for the day, where would you head for the best day's birding?
Oh, that's interesting. Because Lundy's so sort of tall, you know, you've got these high ramparts. It tends to be the plateau, the bit where they built the old lighthouse that gets covered in low cloud. So I would go down. I would sort of go as low down the sidelands as I possibly could. I would consider which way the wind was going. If it was a strong easterly wind like we had last week, and if it was outside the seabird season, as it would be in autumn, I would probably go. I would sort of go low down over the west side somewhere, where I'd be sheltered from the wind and perhaps below the low cloud. And other place I might go to would be the North Light, which can be a good place for watching seabirds. Again, if the cloud base is not too low. Alternatively, I might go to the tavern.
That's always a good option.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nick Blinston has a question. When would you advise booking accommodation on Lundy for a springtime stay, beginning of May, say? He visited last October and booked Castle Cottage, but he had to book it 18 months in advance. Yeah,
it's true. Lundy is very, very popular. It's got limited accommodation, and you do need to book well in advance. I think particularly in the post sort of COVID period, when things begin to get relaxed, a lot more people who had their reservations last year and earlier this year cancelled. They sort of got first dibs on bookings for the foreseeable. Having said that, there's always the opportunity for a last minute cancellation. Those are usually advertised on social media. So you can follow the Lundy company on social media and look out for last minute availability. Camping is often available at shorter notice, but if you really want to get a particular property at a particular time of the year, there's no option really than to book as far ahead as the booking system will let you. And if you go onto the Landmark Trust website, you will see how far ahead that is at any one time.
Thank you. I think that should have answered a couple of other questions. We'd had a question about where's the best place to stay other than in a tent. So thank you for that, Tim. I'm just going to quickly pick up some of the comments. Jacqueline Holt says, brilliant talk. It felt like we were there, from Paul and Jackie. Joy Roscoe, you've whetted my appetite to visit Lundy. Many thanks for an inspirational lecture. So many great comments coming in here. Mike Goss, thanks, Tim. Good to put a face to the name. Really enjoyed the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go straight back to the questions. We've still got, I will have to stop at some point, so I'm afraid I'm not going to get to all of the questions this evening. But my next question, I'm going to go to Jonathan Martin. Now, Tim, you talked about the gannets at the North Light that were no longer breeding. Jonathan Martin asks, would you anticipate the gannets recolonising Lundy in the future?
Well, never say never, but it seems to me personally a little bit unlikely. for those people that know Lundy well, you'll know that there is a prominent offshore rock stack called Gannet's Rock, and that's where originally gannets did breed, and then they moved on to the promontory where North Light is now. I personally think that there's probably a little bit too much human disturbance for them to re-establish now. I think it would require some sort of restriction on where people could go, and that might not be feasible. I mean, one of the philosophies of Lundy and the Landmark Trust is to enable people to be as free as possible, and one of the sort of trade-offs of that is that there's perhaps a bit more disturbance of wildlife than there might be on some islands where they're sort of more strict nature reserves and you're more limited to where you go. But it sort of swings and roundabouts. But I think in the case of gannets, it probably would be quite unlikely that there's anywhere suitable that's sufficiently undisturbed for them to re-establish, unfortunately.
Thank you. Just to note, we've got a few questions asking about where people can watch a recording of this webinar. It will be available online afterwards, and when I wrap up at the end, I'll give you details of how you can watch this back. So do wait around. I'm going to move on to the next question. Catherine Hubbard, do kittiwakes breed on Lundy nowadays?
Yeah, kittiwakes do breed in the vicinity of Jenny's Cove, which you saw on my slides. Unfortunately, they're one of the seabirds that are continuing to decline on Lundy. They're in trouble elsewhere in Britain, as you may know. It's thought that issues related to climate change and the impacts those have on sea temperatures and food availability are likely to be a large part of the explanation. But sadly, Lundy's kittiwake population has relatively low breeding success, and numbers are continuing to decline to just a relatively small number of pairs now, sort of 300 or so nests, whereas a few decades back there would have been thousands. There's a place in the north of Lundy near the North Light called Kittiwake Gully. Tim Davis can certainly remember when that was filled with breeding kittiwakes. There are none there anymore. So it's a little bit sad that Gannet's Rock no longer has gannets and Kittiwake Gully no longer has kittiwakes. But on the other hand, guillemots, razorbills, puffins are all increasing. Guillemots, the last full count in 2017 was 51% up on the corresponding count in 2013. So it's not all bad news, but some seabirds are doing very well, others not well at all.
And Catherine, we did have a talk from Tom Dickens back in the spring of last year about his very long-term study of the kittiwake population. So at the end, when I share details of how to catch up on all these webinars, if you go to our YouTube page, you'll be able to watch Tim's talk about the kittiwakes from, I think it was last May or June that he spoke to us.
And of course, there's also the presentation that Chris D did on bird ringing on Lundy. So if you want to know more about that, I touched on it very briefly tonight. You can look for the recording of Chris's webinar.
Thank you. And that leads very nicely into Martin Batt's question. Martin asks, have you found birds that were ringed on Alderney? A bird observatory was set up there in 2016 and the islands have a great deal in common.
Well, very interesting connection between Lundy and Alderney came to light fairly recently. I mentioned storm petrel, the small seabird that comes ashore under the cover of darkness. It was only proved breeding successfully on Lundy after the eradication of rats, and there's a sort of small but growing population. And the very, very first storm petrel chick known to have fledged successfully from Lundy after the eradication of rats. Which year was that? 2013, 2013, 2015. I lost the exact year from my mind, but it was ringed. It was found as a fledgling getting ready to leave the island, and they migrate to the waters off southern Africa. And it was recaptured a few years later on Alderney. So there you go. There's a nice connection. And also the warden of Alderney Bird Observatory used to be a regular ringer and visitor to Lundy before he was stolen by the Channel Islands.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to take the last two questions now. I just apologise to everybody whose questions I haven't got to. I mean, there are just so many of them. I think we've got at least 30 questions outstanding, but we do need to stop at some point. So apologies if I didn't get to your question. I've been trying to pick out the various different topics to try and cover a broad range of different areas. So sorry if I haven't got to your question. But so the last two questions then. So the first of those comes from Peter Long. Peter says, another splendid presentation. Thank you, Tim. How important is it to record the more commonplace birds and their abundance through the year on Lundy? Presumably there is useful data in there to map changes such as climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. And the logbook that you saw, the one that's kept in the tavern, there's a sort of daily register in there that you can sort of fill in numbers, and that covers every species from the most common to the rarest. And whilst it's always interesting and exciting to see a rare bird, it's really the common species, the breeding birds and the common migrants like swallows that Lundy and bird observatories can play the biggest role in terms of contributing to science and conservation. So I always record every species, the same as I do in my day-to-day bird watching, my local patch here on the North Devon coast. I use Birdtrack, and by submitting the daily numbers that I see of common things like blackbirds, blue tits, it all goes into the national picture, from which population trends are measured, and we know whether species are in trouble and need particular conservation measures.
Thank you, Tim. So our final question goes to Grant Sherman. So many of you who regular visitors to Lundy will remember Grant from working behind the bar in the tavern. It's good to hear from you, Grant. His question, he says, "Hi Tim, do you know where the white-tailed eagle came from? Did he hear that they are now breeding on the Isle of Wight?"
Yeah, hi Grant, and I should say for everybody else's benefit that Grant is not only a former island resident and barman, but also guillemot botherer extraordinaire. So yeah, he's undertaken a long-term study of guillemots, the breeding guillemots on the island. The white-tailed eagle, yeah, it was a satellite tagged bird. It was from the reintroduction program on the Isle of Wight, which is being run by the Forestry Commission and led by the Roy Dennis Foundation. It was one of two birds that were released in August last year, and in there it had been brought from Scotland as a nestling, reared in an aviary and then released on the Isle of Wight in August. Young white-tailed eagles in their formative years, which is quite a long period of time before a white-tailed eagle reaches maturity, they wander widely, and this one was wandering over southern England, Devon, Cornwall. After Lundy, it was tracked back to the North Devon coast near Clovelly, and then down into Cornwall. It spent quite a long time in Cornwall. And if you go to the website of the Roy Dennis Foundation, you can find all of the latest information about the white-tailed eagles there. But there's every chance that they'll be breeding again in southern England in the near future. and who knows, returning to Lundy possibly as a breeding bird, as they once did. The last one was shot on Lundy in the 19th century, and its stuffed body is in Ilfracombe Museum, sadly.
And on that cheerful note, that's the end of the questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us, Tim. Before I say my final farewells, I've just got a few bits of admin to get through. So I'm just going to share my screen this time. So this is really just a reminder that I'm putting these talks on to support the Lundy Field Society. Tim mentioned in his own talk the LFS, but if you haven't joined the LFS yet, details are up on the screen, and we also posted a link in the chat earlier on. Membership is open to all, so it doesn't matter whether you have a specific interest in Lundy or whether you're a birder or have another interest. Everyone is welcome to join. Your subscriptions directly support our conservation work on Lundy. You can also find us on social media. Tim mentioned this in his talk as well. There's an LFS Facebook page, and there is a very, very active Facebook group called Lundy Island. So please look out for that on Facebook, and the hashtags and Twitter and Instagram handles are up on the screen at the moment. I've also talked about where you can catch up on these talks. So if you want to watch this webinar again, it'll be online, certainly in a few hours, and if not by the morning. Or if you want to catch up on any of the previous talks, they're all available online. So just go to this address on the screen. We have a growing and varied selection of talks covering so many aspects of Lundy's history, natural history, and our conservation work. We've already touched on two of the bird-related ones. So Chris D talked to us about bird ringing, and Tom Dickens talked to us about his long-term study of the kittiwakes. We've also had 3 talks about photography, and you'll find, if you go back and watch some of those, you'll see some stunning images of the land birds and the seabirds that have all been taken on Lundy. So do look those previous webinars up. So I'll stop sharing that. So looking to the future, I'm currently finalising plans for our next webinar, which will be in March. Details on how to join that will be posted on Facebook, and members of the LFS will receive an email when details are ready. As you leave this session, you'll be asked to complete a short feedback survey. As ever, I'm very grateful for the feedback, so please do spend a minute or two filling it in. Thank you. My thanks also to Dave Richards for hosting us again this evening. These events really could not take place without Dave's support. And thank you, Tim. It's been a really, really great evening. As I mentioned at the start, it was going to be probably the highest attendance that we've ever had, and I'm certain that it was. We had over 350 Zoom sessions running, and I think there were about 40 YouTube sessions running when I looked at one point, and that means there must have easily been over 400 people watching, possibly even more this evening, because I know many people will not be watching alone at home. So it's been fantastic to have such a great turnout. I've really enjoyed it, and I know that I'm certainly going to get more out of my trips to Lundy from now on. So thank you.
Okay.
Time to say goodbye, really. So do you want to say cheerio to our audience?
Yeah, I'd love to say goodbye to everyone. Those of you that I don't know, but it's also been great to hear the names of many Lundy birding friends and acquaintances. Hope you've all enjoyed it. I know that there are a lot more questions than Michael could get through. There is an email address associated with the Birds of Lundy website. If you've got burning questions still that we couldn't get to, you can contact me through that email address on the website. Please do. And as I say, I just hope that all of us get the chance to go back to Lundy again soon. Special hello to anyone who's joining us from the island, and we look forward to being back with you as soon as conditions allow. Happy birding, and thanks very much to everybody who joined us tonight.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, I know that we did have some of the islanders watching. I was able to check the list of participants while you're talking. So yeah, hello to everyone who's on Lundy. And of course, if you've got a question which we haven't been able to answer, then please do. If you can't find Tim's email address, then drop me a line, and I'll do my best to send it on to Tim. Okay, well that's it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've had a great evening, and I hope that you can join me again